The day I buried my father was the quietest day of my life. There were no crowds at the cemetery, no distant relatives pretending they cared, just me, the priest, and the man who had spent his entire life raising me alone. My father wasn't the kind of person who made friends. He lived quietly, worked quietly, and after my mother supposedly left us when I was 5, he dedicated every moment of his life to making sure I never felt alone. After the funeral, we returned to my childhood home. The lawyer handed me the deed to the house along with a small sealed envelope. "Your father wanted you to read this only after his funeral," he said before quietly leaving. I expected a heartfelt goodbye, maybe some advice about life, maybe an apology for all the things we never said to each other. Instead, the note contained only one sentence. "Whatever happens, do not open the basement door." That was it. No explanation. No signature. Nothing. A cold feeling settled over me. I slowly walked down the hallway toward the basement. The steel door looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, except for one thing. 3 brand-new heavy-duty padlocks hung from the handle. I'd lived in this house for 25 years. Those locks had never been there before. I stood there staring at them, trying to understand why a dying man would spend his final days securing a basement, instead of writing a goodbye letter to his only son. Every memory from my childhood suddenly felt different. Every strange rule. Every unanswered question. My father had one final wish. Respected. But as I stood in that silent hallway, unable to take my eyes off those 3 padlocks, another thought crept into my mind. What could possibly be hidden behind that door, that my father wanted to keep buried even after his death? For the next 3 days I tried to ignore it. I cleaned the living room, sorted through old photo albums, packed away my father's clothes, and even started fixing the leaking kitchen sink. But no matter what I did, my eyes always drifted toward the end of the hallway. Toward the steel basement door. The more I tried not to think about it, the more memories came flooding back. I remembered waking up as a child at 3 or 4 in the morning and hearing footsteps beneath the floor. My father would disappear downstairs for hours, only coming back covered in dust with dark circles under his eyes. Sometimes there was a strange chemical smell lingering in the hallway. Whenever I asked what he was doing, he always smiled and said, "Just fixing old things." And there was one rule he never bent. Never go into the basement. Not even once. Back then, I thought every parent had strange rules. Now those memories felt completely different. My imagination began filling the silence with terrifying possibilities. Was there a body hidden down there? Had my quiet, gentle father been living a secret life that nobody knew about? Was the man who raised me really the person I thought he was? I hated myself for even thinking it. He had sacrificed everything for me. But if he had nothing to hide, why lock the basement with 3 brand-new padlocks just before he died? By the 4th day, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I couldn't sell this house. I couldn't live in it. I couldn't even sleep peacefully. Until I knew what was behind that door. I walked into the garage and found my father's heavy bolt cutters hanging exactly where he'd left them. They felt cold in my hands as I carried them back into the hallway. I stopped in front of the steel door. The 3 padlocks reflected the dim light above me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered. Then I raised the bolt cutters toward the first lock. I barely slept that night. The basement became my entire world. Hour after hour, I opened filing cabinets packed with police reports, newspaper clippings, road maps, photographs, witness statements, and notebooks written entirely in my father's handwriting. Everything was organized with incredible precision. Every victim had their own file. Every sighting had a date. Every map was covered with colored pins and handwritten notes. This wasn't the work of a paranoid old man. It was the work of someone who had devoted 30 years of his life to solving a single case. As I pieced everything together, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Nearly every victim was a young woman who disappeared along the same stretch of County River Road. The disappearances happened months or even years apart, making them almost impossible to connect. The local police had dismissed the rumors decades ago, calling the so-called River Road Phantom nothing more than an urban legend. But my father hadn't believed them. He had tracked the killer's movements, estimated his cooling-off periods, documented changes in the suspect's vehicle over the years, and even predicted where the next abduction might happen. The level of detail was so unbelievable that it felt like I was reading the work of a veteran homicide detective instead of a quiet mechanic. Then I noticed one folder sitting alone on the corner of the desk. Unlike every other file, this one didn't have a case number. It had a name. Emily Carter's. My mother's names. My hands began shaking as I opened it. The first page contained a newspaper clipping dated 30 years earlier. Local woman missing. The second page held the police report. The third contained one of my father's handwritten notes. He told Ethan she left us. He deserves a childhood without monsters. I couldn't breathe. My mother hadn't abandoned us. She had been the first victim. My father had lied to protect me from a truth no child should ever have to carry. He spent the next 3 decades chasing the man who stole her from us, never giving up, never letting the case die. The basement wasn't built to hide a terrible secret. It was built to keep one alive. And for the first time since his funeral, I finally understood why my father wanted that door to stay closed. Because once I knew the truth, there was no turning back. Once I knew my mother hadn't abandoned us, I couldn't stop reading. I spent the entire night in the basement, moving from one file to the next, trying to understand what my father had discovered before he died. Most of the investigation ended months earlier, but one folder immediately caught my attention. It was sitting alone on the center of the desk. Unlike the others, the file wasn't covered in dust. Someone had been working on it recently. The date on the cover made my heart skip a beat. 7 days before my father's death. I opened it. Inside were photographs of a young waitress named Lily Harper, who worked at a diner just outside town. According to the newspaper clipping attached to the file, she had disappeared only 3 weeks earlier after finishing her evening shift. The police believed she had simply run away, but my father had circled that conclusion in red ink and written one word beside it. Wrong. The deeper I looked, the more disturbed I became. There were fresh maps, recent surveillance photos, handwritten timelines, and notes that hadn't even faded with age. My father hadn't been investigating an old cold case. He'd been chasing someone who was still hunting. Then I found a yellow legal pad lying beneath the file. The final page had been ripped halfway across, as though he had been interrupted while writing. The last sentence stopped me cold. I finally found the missing link. Every victim, every location, it all leads back to. That was it. The sentence ended there. No names. No explanation. Just an unfinished thought. I stared at the page for several seconds before another realization struck me. My father was perfectly healthy. He walked every morning. He never smoked. He rarely drank. Yet somehow, only a week after writing this note, he suffered a sudden heart attack and died without warning. Until that moment, I had accepted it as a tragic coincidence. Now, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. If my father really discovered the identity of the River Road Phantom, then maybe he hadn't died because his heart failed. Maybe someone made sure it did. And if that was true, the killer knew exactly how close my father had gotten. Which meant there was a terrifying possibility I could no longer ignore. If the killer had silenced my father, I might be next. That thought stayed with me the entire night. I went back through my father's notes, hoping he'd left one final clue. Most of the pages were filled with maps and timelines, but one name appeared over and over again. Mr. Thomas Henderson. Every mention of his name had been circled in thick red ink. Henderson owned the town's old salvage yard on the edge of County River Road. He rarely spoke to anyone, lived alone, and had been questioned years ago in connection with one of the disappearances before the police quietly dropped him as a suspect. My father had collected dozens of photographs of the property, license plate numbers, and even a rough sketch of the yard. The more I looked at the evidence, the more convinced I became. This had to be him. If my father had uncovered the missing link, maybe Henderson realized he was getting too close and eliminated him before he could expose the truth. I couldn't sit around waiting anymore. That evening, just after sunset, I drove to the salvage yard. The property was surrounded by rusted cars, broken machinery, and stacks of twisted metal that looked like giant shadows in the moonlight. I slipped through a gap in the fence and quietly searched between the rows of abandoned vehicles. According to my father's notes, Lily Harper drove a blue sedan. If I could find it, I'd finally have proofs. I checked one row, then another. Every creak of metal made my heart race. Suddenly, my flashlight landed on a blue car hidden beneath a torn tarp. My pulse skyrocketed. I hurried toward it, barely noticing how silent everything around me had become. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked behind me. Don't move. Before I could react, someone slammed me to the ground. The flashlight rolled away into the darkness as a heavy boot pressed against my back. Cold steel touched the side of my neck. I slowly turned my head. Standing over me was an older man with a gray beard, worn work clothes, and a shotgun pointed directly at my chest. His eyes were filled with anger. What the hell are you doing in my yard? For the first time since opening the basement door, I wasn't chasing a killer anymore. I was staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun. Please, I said, raising my hands. My name is Ethan Carter. The old man's expression didn't change. I know about the basements. The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. His grip on the shotgun loosened. What did you say? My father's Michael Carter. He spent 30 years investigating the River Road Phantom. I found everything after his funeral. The shotgun slowly lowered. The man's face, once filled with anger, suddenly went pale. He stared at me for several seconds before whispering my father's name under his breath. Then, to my complete shock, tears filled his eyes. He dropped the shotgun onto the dirt and grabbed my shoulders, helping me back onto my feet. I thought he'd burned it all, he said, his voice shaking. I begged him to destroy those files if anything ever happened. I stood there speechless. You knew my father's. A sad smile crossed his face. For 10 years. He walked over to an old workbench and picked up a faded photograph. It showed a teenage girl with bright eyes and a wide smile. My daughter, he said quietly, Enma. I immediately recognized her. Victim number 4. The same face I'd seen on one of the basement boards. My father never suspected you. Henderson nodded. He was the only person who believed me. Everyone else thought Enma ran away. Your father refused to let her become another forgotten file. Suddenly, every photograph of the salvage yard made sense. My father hadn't been watching Henderson. He'd been protecting him. For nearly a decade, the two of them had secretly investigated the murders together. Then Henderson's expression turned serious. The night your father died, he called me. My heart skipped a beat. He sounded terrified. I've never heard fear in that man's voice before. What did he say? Henderson looked me straight in the eyes. He said, Thomas, I finally know who he is. A chill ran down my spine. Then he said something I'll never forget. Henderson took a slow breath. The devil isn't hiding in the woods anymore. He paused. He wears a badge. My mind went completely blank. A badge? Not a drifter. Not Henderson. Not some stranger living outside town. A police officer. Someone with access to every investigation. Someone who could erase evidence, redirect suspects, and make murders disappear for 30 years. And suddenly, my father's heart attack made terrifying sense. Neither Henderson nor I spoke during the drive back to my childhood home. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy. We both knew the man responsible for 30 years of disappearances wasn't hiding somewhere in the woods. He was wearing a uniform, shaking hands with people every day, and using his badge to stay invisible. The moment we entered the basement, Henderson walked straight to my father's desk. "Mike always said," he murmured, "if anything happened to him, the answer would still be here." For nearly an hour, we searched every drawer, every cabinet, and every notebook. Just as I was about to give up, Henderson knocked on the bottom of the desk drawer. The sound was hollow. "Help me lift it." I slid my fingers underneath the wooden panel, and with a little pressure, it popped free. Hidden beneath it was a small black leather ledger. There was no title, no names, just a tiny brass lock that had already been broken. Inside, every page was filled with strange symbols, numbers, and letters that made no sense. At first, I thought it was another dead end, until Henderson smiled. "It's Mike's cipher." He pulled one of my father's old notebooks from the shelf, and together we slowly decoded the pages. Line by line, my father's final investigation came to life. One detail appeared in almost every case. The killer always kept something from each victim. Not jewelry, not money, their driver's licenses. According to my father's notes, he collected them as trophies and stored every single one inside an antique silver cigarette case he carried everywhere. It was the one mistake the killer had repeated for 3 decades. Then we reached the final page. My father had written one sentence. "The killer is." The rest of the page was gone. Not torn neatly. Ripped out violently. The edges were jagged, as though someone had been in a desperate hurry to remove it. Henderson slowly closed the ledger. Neither of us needed to say it out loud. Someone had entered this basement after my father died. Someone knew exactly where he kept his investigation. Someone had taken only one page. The page with the killer's name. Which meant one thing. The murderer hadn't just killed my father. He had stood in this very room, trying to erase the truth. And somehow, he still didn't know that my father had left us enough to finish what he started. The murderer had stood in my father's basement, trying to erase the truth. I looked at Henderson. "If the killer is a cop, who can we trust?" He didn't answer immediately. The truth was there weren't many options. Then one name came to my mind. Sheriff Ray. Ray had been my father's best friend for over 30 years. He taught me how to fish when I was 8, came to every birthday I could remember, and after my father's funeral, he was the one who stood beside the coffin and delivered the eulogy. If there was anyone my father would have trusted with his life, it was Ray. "I need to talk to him," I said. Henderson hesitated. "Are you sure?" "He'll know how to contact the state police or the FBI. We can't take this to the local department if the killer is wearing a badge." Before leaving, I packed the ledger, the photographs, the missing persons files, and my father's notes into an old leather briefcase. If anything happened to me, I wanted the evidence together in one place. It was nearly 10 at night when I pulled into Ray's driveway. The porch light was already on. Almost as if he had been expecting someone. He opened the door before I even knocked. "Ethan," he said with a warm smile, "come in, son." For the first time in days, I felt my shoulders relax. The familiar smell of coffee filled the house. Family photographs covered the walls, and a fishing trophy I had won as a kid still sat on his bookshelf. Ray noticed the briefcase in my hand. "You look worried," he said. "Let's sit down, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." He disappeared into the kitchen and called back, "Coffee." I nodded. As I waited in the living room, I looked around the house I had visited hundreds of times growing up. It felt safe. It felt familiar. It felt like the one place where nothing bad could possibly happen. I had no ideas. I was about to walk straight into the most dangerous room of my life. Ray returned with 2 mugs of coffee and sat across from me. For the next several minutes I told him everything. The locked basement, my mother's file, Henderson, the hidden ledger, the missing page. I even opened the briefcase and showed him my father's evidence. Ray listened without interrupting. His face showed the same concern it always had whenever I was in trouble growing up. When I finished, he sighed and stood up. "I think we both need a little more sugar," he said with a small smile before walking into the kitchen. As I waited, my eyes wandered around the familiar living room. Family photos covered the walls. There was one of Ray and my father fishing together when they were young. Another showed them standing beside my first bicycle on my 10th birthday. I smiled. Then my eyes drifted to the fireplace. Sitting perfectly in the center of the mantel. was an antique silver cigarette case. My heart stopped. Every word from the ledger came rushing back. The killer always keeps the victim's driver's licenses inside an antique silver cigarette case. I stared at it, unable to breathe. No, it couldn't be. My eyes slowly moved from the cigarette case to the photographs, then toward the kitchen where Ray was humming quietly as he stirred the coffee. The pieces finally fit together. The reason every investigation failed. The reason evidence disappeared. The reason my father never trusted the local police. The reason the final page had been torn from the ledger. Sheriff Ray, the man who taught me to fish. The man who stood beside my father's coffin. The man I had called uncle my entire life. He wasn't protecting this town. He had been hunting it. Then another horrifying realization struck me. My father never wrote, "Don't open the basement door," to hide his investigation. He wrote it to protect me. Because he knew that after his death, the first person I would run to for help would be Ray. And at that exact moment, I heard footsteps returning from the kitchen. Ray walked into the living room carrying my coffee. He smiled the same warm smile I'd known since I was a child. "There you go, son." But as he handed me the mug, he noticed something. I wasn't looking at him. I was staring at the antique silver cigarette case on the fireplace. For a few long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his smile slowly disappeared. The kindness in his eyes faded, replaced by something cold, something empty. He followed my gaze to the cigarette case. Then he looked back at me. "So," he said quietly, "you figured it out." A chill ran through my entire body. Without breaking eye contact, Ray slowly reached beneath his sheriff's jacket. Then he pulled out his service pistol. He didn't point it at me immediately. He simply held it at his side, as though this was just another conversation between old friends. "Your father," he said with a tired smile, "was always too smart for his own good." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Ray sighed and sat down across from me. For 30 years, I solved every investigation before anyone else did. It took me a second to understand. Then I realized what he meant. He wasn't solving them. He was controlling them. Every missing report, every piece of evidence, every suspect, every dead end. He had manipulated every investigation from the very beginning. "And your father," Ray continued, just wouldn't stop digging. My hands clenched around the coffee mug. "You killed him." Ray nodded without the slightest hint of regret. The poison was slow, it mimicked a heart attack perfectly, no one questioned it. Hearing those words hurt more than I expected. The man who taught me to fish. Who came to every birthday. Who stood beside me at my father's funeral. Had murdered the only parent I ever had. Then Ray finally raised the pistol. His voice remained calm. "I'm sorry, Ethan. But after everything you've discovered, you can't leave this house alive." My mind raced as I looked around the room. One mistake, one wrong move, and Ray would tell the world that a grieving son couldn't live with his father's death. So he took his own life. I had walked into this house looking for help. Instead, I had walked into the killer's trap. Ray's finger tightened on the trigger. I knew I had one chance. Without thinking, I grabbed the mug of steaming coffee and threw it straight into his face. He screamed in pain as the boiling liquid splashed across his eyes. The gun fired. Bang! The bullet shattered the window behind me. I didn't hesitate. I dove headfirst through the glass. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs as I crashed onto the front lawn. Sharp pieces of glass tore into my arms, but I forced myself back to my feet and ran. Another gunshot echoed through the night. This one found its mark. A burning pain exploded across my left shoulder. The bullet had only grazed me, but warm blood immediately began soaking through my shirt. I stumbled into the woods behind Ray's property, desperately trying to stay out of sight. My breathing was loud. My vision blurred. Every branch that snapped beneath my feet felt like it was giving away my position. Behind me, I saw the beam of a flashlight slowly moving through the trees. Ray wasn't chasing me. He was hunting me. His calm voice echoed through the darkness. You know, Ethan, your mother ran through these same woods. I froze. He laughed softly. She thought she could escape too. My stomach turned. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was telling me the truth. I was exhausted, bleeding, and completely unarmed. There was no way I could outrun a sheriff who had spent his entire life tracking people through these woods. Then I remembered something. Ray had left his police cruiser parked in the driveway. Instead of running deeper into the forest, I quietly circled back through the trees, keeping low until I reached the edge of his property. Ray's flashlight was still sweeping the woods in the opposite direction. This was my only chance. I sprinted toward the cruiser, yanked open the driver's door, and found the keys still in the ignition. The engine roared to life. By the time Ray realized what I'd done, I was already speeding away. I wasn't driving toward the police. I wasn't driving to the hospital. There was only one place my father had prepared for this moment. The basement. And somehow, I knew the final battle was waiting for me there. I drove faster than I ever had before. My wounded shoulder burned with every turn of the steering wheel, and Ray's headlights appeared in my rearview mirror only seconds later. He was closing the distance. I swerved into my father's driveway, lost control, and slammed the police cruiser into the front yard. Before the vehicle had even stopped moving, I threw the door open and sprinted into the house. Straight for the basement. I rushed down the stairs, pulled the heavy steel door shut, and locked it from the inside. For a few seconds, silence. Then came the first gunshot. Bang! One of the new padlocks exploded off the door. Another shot. Then another. The steel door burst open as Ray stepped into the basement with his pistol raised. He looked around the investigation room and laughed. 30 years, he said. Your father wasted 30 years chasing me. He slowly walked between the evidence boards, tearing photographs from the walls and throwing files onto the floor. He was never going to win. He raised the pistol and aimed it directly at my chest. It's over, Ethan. My heart was pounding, but I remembered something my father had written in one of his notebooks. If he ever finds this room, he'll believe he's trapped you. I reached beneath the old wooden desk, exactly where my father had marked with a tiny scratch. My fingers found a hidden metal lever. I pulled it. A deafening metallic crash echoed through the basement. A massive reinforced steel grate dropped from the ceiling, slamming across the staircase between Ray and the exit. He spun around and fired twice at the bars, but the bullets barely left a mark. His expression changed for the first time that night. He was trapped. I looked at the desk again and noticed a small red switch hidden beside the lever. Without hesitation, I pressed it. A faint green light blinked on. Henderson had once told me my father trusted no one in the local police. Now I finally understood why. The switch activated a silent emergency transmitter wired directly to the state police headquarters, completely bypassing the local department. My father hadn't built this basement to hide from the killer. He had built it to catch him. Even after his death, he was still one step ahead of Sheriff Ray. And for the first time in 30 years, the hunter had become the prisoner. Ray pounded against the steel grate, shouting threats as the sound of distant sirens slowly grew louder. Within minutes, state police officers stormed into the house. Since the silent alarm bypassed the local department, none of Ray's deputies had any chance to interfere. They found him exactly where my father had planned, locked inside the very basement he'd spent decades trying to destroy. The investigation moved quickly after that. A search warrant was executed on Ray's home, and hidden inside a locked cabinet, investigators found the antique silver cigarette case. One by one, they removed dozens of driver's licenses belonging to women who had disappeared over the last 30 years. It was the evidence my father had spent his entire life searching for. Hours later, another team raided an abandoned hunting cabin listed in Ray's old property records. Inside, they found Lily Harper alive, weak, frightened, but alive. My father had been only days away from saving her himself. A week later, I returned to the basement alone. The evidence board still covered every wall. Thousands of photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes surrounded me. For 30 years, this room had been my father's entire world. While everyone else believed he was a lonely old mechanic who couldn't let go of the past, he had been fighting for families who had already lost hope. I walked over to the board that held my mother's photograph. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at the face of a woman who abandoned her family. I was looking at my father's first reason to keep fighting. I carefully removed the picture from the board, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and quietly smiled. I never sold the house. Instead, I spent the next several months transforming the basement. The corkboards came down. Fresh paint covered the old concrete walls. Large windows were installed to let sunlight pour inside, and the room that had once carried decades of grief became a peaceful study where I could remember my parents without fear. Sometimes I still sit by that window with my father's old notebooks beside me. People in town no longer remember him as the strange man who lived alone at the edge of the county. They remember him as the man who never gave up. As I looked around the room one last time, I realized something that brought tears to my eyes. My father wasn't a paranoid hermit. He wasn't obsessed. He was simply the bravest man I will ever know. And because he refused to stop searching, the darkness that haunted our family for 30 years finally came to an end.